All right. Hi. Hi, everyone. I apologize for the delay. I've had a little bit of trouble figuring things out today, but that's what happens when we try something new. So I hope that you're willing to bear with me because I have some pretty old school solutions for the issues that I'm running into. So basically, I have two screens up, and I have the chat on one screen that's over here and the camera on another screen that's over here. And I tried to figure out how to share a stream with you so that I could pull up the lecture and talk about it at the same time. And unfortunately, that was not working for me. So I've tried to figure out something else, and we'll see if it works. And I'm grateful that my team has not needed to do a whole lot with their technology or their devices, because now I have access to lots of devices, and I've just messed something up. I can pull the lecture slides up on one computer and have you or the webcam pointed to. If you want to hop to D2L and pull up the lecture slides, they are in the week 13 folder under lecture, and that will probably be easier to follow along, to be honest with you, but this is my very basic tech knowledge at work, and my very advanced problem solving skills at work. So I apologize that it's not very technologically inclined, but it is what I could come up with in a very short period of time. So I just learned that there are some folks who are not able to access the items on D12, which is no good. So, and then D12 yesterday afternoon decided to change some things, which may have limited our ability to gather there. So that's fine. We can work around it. It's no problem. But did require just some thinking outside of boxes. So I'm sure you all could have figured this out better than I, but this is what I figured out, and hopefully it will work. Okay, so I think this is ready to go. So I'm just going to see what I can adjust here. Get my hoodie strings out of the way. And you know what? It's not terrible. I mean, it's not great. I know that. I'm sorry. But it is what we are working with. And I'm just missing one thing. So I'm going to ask for some assistance from my handy dandy stepson. Hey, Vince, could you just pass me that mouse, please?
Yep.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Okay, so now I think that I'm ready to go. And again, I apologize for the delay, but I'll do my best to make this succinct so that I'm not taking up too much of your time. So I apologize that this might be a little bit like wavy, but hopefully it's kind of hypnotic, so maybe it's relaxing for you. I hope that that's the case. And it's also going to be backwards, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So going to D12 will be your best bet, and just listening to me explain things and following along with the slides is going to be your best bet. But this will, I'll proceed with this plan, and this will just help me with what I'm going to be talking about. So the first thing that I wanted to just address and share with you is some wisdom that I came across this week from Adam Grant, who is a brilliant organizational psychologist that I really, really enjoy the work of. And so if you're finding that the world is getting a little bit heavy, it's totally understandable, and things are stressful and causing some anxiety, and that's all totally understandable and normal right now. We, we're in this unprecedented thing, and none of us know how long this is going to last, or where things are going to go from here, or what's going to happen next. And so this wisdom from Adam Grant brought me a lot of comfort this week. And basically when he said, when grieving the loss of normalcy, it's important to remember that this is not permanent. Okay, so this too shall pass. We don't know when, we don't know what's going to happen before it does, but this too shall pass. So it can be really hard when we have these emotions that come forward and we're not really sure what to do about them. But what we have to remember is that acknowledging our emotions doesn't give them power over us. It just allows them to move through. And, feelings of emotions like anxiety and uncertainty and maybe a bit of fear, those are uncomfortable things to feel. So it can be hard to deal with those. But when we acknowledge that they're okay, those are okay things to feel right now, then it just gives those emotions the power that they need to move through us and for us to handle them. So just don't be afraid of that. And I know for me, I am what my fiance likes to describe as a control enthusiast. So I love having control over everything, including my emotions. And that's just not possible. So anyways, this, like I said, this brought me a lot of comfort this week, and I hope it does the same for you. Oh, Jesse, the text is the right way for you. That's excellent. I'm glad to hear that. What I'm going to do is pop up the PowerPoint on another screen, and that way I can see that, and I will minimize it so I can see the chat at the same time. So anyhow, there's lots of things like, some stress involved with not knowing how you're going to host a lecture in 30 seconds and all sorts of stuff going on in the world right now. So the things that you're feeling are okay. As long as you're not feeling like you want to hurt someone, then that's maybe not okay. But certainly being uncertain and a little bit fearful and anxious is totally expected, and you are not alone in that. So just remember, this too shall pass. We only have control over our reaction to this thing. So react in a way that keeps you going, whether that's, just turning on some super loud music and having a dance party, or immersing yourself in your studies and assignments, whatever that is, as long as you're not hurting anyone, it's okay. And no one can tell you how to cope with something like this, because we don't know. We don't know what the right answer is. So do what you need to do. Take care of yourself first. Make sure you're doing the things like washing your hands and practicing good hygiene. Make sure that you're bringing in some good news into your world and not just focusing on all the bad stuff that's going on, because there's a lot of that, and it can get overwhelming if that's all we're focusing on. But for me, I'm exercising every day, getting out with my dogs, having fun with them. For those of you who follow me on social media, I posted yesterday, there's bee poop all over our yard, which is really awesome. It's one of the greatest signs of spring for us. So there are lots of things that we can find in our everyday life that can give us that little bit of normalcy, and we just need to cling to that now more than ever. So just make sure that you're doing those things and collecting those things that make you whole, instead of just focusing on all the negative, because there's a lot of that. Okay? So I just thought that was worth acknowledging. And without further ado, we can get on to the much more boring concept of pesticide toxicity, storage, and transport. So this really rounds out what we've talked about all semester with regards to pesticides. So this brings a lot of things that we have chatted about already, just to kind of a culmination. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on today. And you can see the folks in the background keeping busy and trying not to distract me. They can see you, for the record. I hope they didn't do anything inappropriate. Anyways, so we have talked about before the calculation, or the equation for risk. So risk equals toxicity times exposure. And so when we're talking about pesticide toxicity, we need to be aware of the risks involved. And we've spoken about this many times, where we use pesticides, we have to make sure we're aware of the risks. And so in order to reduce our risk, we're looking at either reducing toxicity or reducing exposure. And this can happen through a number of methods or ways. So we can, if we have a choice of products, we can choose the less toxic option. We can reduce our exposure by making sure we're wearing proper PPE and properly maintained PPE. We can select the best formulation for the job. So, if it's really windy, maybe you want to use something heavier. So instead of a spray, using a dust that you can inject into cracks and crevices instead. That may not always be an option, but if it is, it's a good option for reducing risk. And then just making sure that we're employing safe practices. So this comes down to storage, it comes down to transport, it comes down to equipment maintenance. It's just a kind of a blanket statement for making sure that you're taking care of everything and that everything is in good repair so that breakdowns and spills and things like that are less likely, and that all equals exposure. So you want to make sure that you're reducing that exposure to therefore reduce your risk. All right. Sorry, it's just taking me a while to make sure that everything's on the same page. So when we talk about pesticide toxicity, there is acute toxicity and chronic toxicity. And these are likely terms that you've heard before with other things. So, different types of contamination or stress or things like that. So acute toxicity just refers to effects that are pretty obvious pretty quickly, not necessarily right away, but usually within about 24 hours. And the effects of acute toxicity or the symptoms of acute toxicity are often obvious and reversible if proper medical attention is sought in a good time frame. So very important to make sure that if acute toxicity is an issue, that medical attention is sought immediately. And it usually comes from either a single dose or exposure or multiple doses within a very short time frame. So usually this is like within 24 hours. So let's say your respirator malfunctions and you're inhaling pesticide and you don't really notice. And then over the course of the day, that small exposure builds up, and then all of a sudden at the end of the day you start feeling some acute symptoms. So that would be an example of multiple doses within a short time frame. The chronic toxicity is a little bit more problematic. As the name implies, it comes from multiple exposures over a long period of time, or it's one exposure, but the chemical is not something that causes effects to be seen right away. So may not be obvious or noticeable for a long period of time. And often with chronic effects, they are irreversible. So by the time the issue shows its face, there's nothing we can do about it, unfortunately. So, and this can be, like I said, multiple exposures over a long period of time. So when you're applying pesticides as a career, this is something to be very aware of, because those safe practices come into play here. If we're not using these things carefully and making sure that we're protecting ourselves, then the chemicals that we use can build up in our bodies, much like they can in other organisms, like we've talked about before. So for folks looking to get into pesticide application, there is a specific blood test that we go through, and it's just, in our normal physical, and they measure the levels of pesticides, I think in our kidneys, well, it'd be just in our blood. But anyways, there is some test that measures those levels over time so that things can be kept mute, so just so that we can keep an eye on things with our doctor. So something to consider if going into the field. Toxicity symptoms are hugely variable. So on this screen, it doesn't even come close to covering all of them. In general, a lot of the symptoms of pesticide poisoning are the same as hangover. So in our industry, with our team specifically, we try and encourage them not to come to work hungover, which is probably always something that bosses encourage. But in our work, it's more important than most, because those symptoms of a hangover, dehydration, lightheadedness, things like that, can mimic the pesticide poisoning symptoms. So you may just think you're hungover, but there's something much more serious going on. So I just put some big ones on the screen here for you, or in this presentation. So some symptoms of acute toxicity include headache and blurred vision, skin blisters. So, thinking of obvious and reversible, maybe not reversible or treatable, convulsions and vomiting. So, convulsions and skin blisters, I've never had a hangover quite that bad. I don't know about you, but certainly some other things, I have maybe experienced those things at work when I didn't go to bed or behave as responsibly as I could the night before. Let's leave it there. And then some symptoms of chronic toxicity. We've got skin irritation. So just, irreversible skin irritation. So dryness, redness, eczema type symptoms, reduced body weight, organ damage, tumors, birth defects, and nerve damage. So just gives you an idea of, it's not that chronic toxicity symptoms are less serious. It's just that we don't see them for a long time, and some of them, tumors can be maybe not reversed but managed. However, there's a big difference in the severity of the symptoms. So measuring toxicity, we have talked about before, just briefly with LD50s and LC50s, and I believe that you're aware of what these are, but just as a refresher, an LD50 is the lethal dose, an LC50 is the lethal concentration. So dose or concentration, and it's an estimation of what is believed to be lethal for humans. It's established based on what is lethal for 50% of test subjects, and that is then projected for human health. This is what we believe to be the lethal limit for this product. So LD50 and LC50 is measured in milligrams of active ingredient per kilogram of body weight. So it's a bit convoluted there, but basically what this means is if we have an LD50, let's say of 10, LD50 10, it doesn't mean that 10 milligrams of that product would be lethal to you. It is 10 milligrams per kilogram of your body weight. So if it's 10 milligrams of active ingredient per kilogram, if our LD50 is 10 and we weigh, let's say for ease of math, we weigh 100 kilograms, then we would need to multiply 100 times the 10. So we multiply the 10 and the LD50 by 100, or our body weight, and then what would be lethal for us if we weighed that much would be 1,000 milligrams of the active ingredient. So I hope that makes sense. But the lower the value, the more toxic the product is. So 10 would be a pretty toxic product, but that 10 or whatever the number is needs to be multiplied by your body weight in kilograms. Okay. And this is a good measurement for acute toxicity, but there aren't really measurements available for chronic toxicity because it is so dependent on the product and the type of exposure and how long you're exposed to it and all those sorts of things. So there are a lot of variables at play there. But when we talk about LD50 and LC50, it gives us a measurement of that acute toxicity. It also gives us an overall view of how toxic the product is. So keep in mind, the lower the LD50 value or LC50 value, the more toxic the product is. So when we're comparing products, this is one thing that, we're always going to be able to find information on, and it's a good idea to choose the product with the higher LD50 or LC50 number. Okay, so I do have access to the chat. I won't be able to look at you and read the chat at the same time, but I am keeping an eye on it. So same rules as always apply. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop open the live chat and stick them there anytime for me. Very grateful to know that you are able to read the text okay. So that's great, and I appreciate the comments there. So moving on to pesticide storage. Pesticide storage is regulated under the Pesticides Act. And so if you remember from last week, wow, that was just a week ago, crazy. But we talked about legislation last week, and the Pesticides Act is a provincial piece of legislation. So storage is regulated by the provincial governing body for pesticide use, which is the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. And basically, there's a bunch of rules for storing pesticides just to make sure that it is done in a safe manner, because if pesticides aren't stored properly, then a lot of human harm can come from that, and a lot of environmental harm can come from spills and things like that. So there are a lot of rules with regards to pesticide storage, but the basics are here on the screen for you. So pesticides must be stored in an area. You have to have a specific area dedicated to pesticide storage, and that area must be in a space where other humans, especially kids or your employees, are not likely to come into contact with it, and no animal or human food or drink is stored in the same spot. So a good analogy for this is, if you have a lunchroom, you don't want to be storing your pesticides in the lunchroom beside your granola bars, which I'm sure for all of us is common sense, but these rules are here for a reason. So someone has done things a little irresponsibly, and so now there are very strict guidelines for how to store things. So some other things they want to see is a clean and organized space. So this includes shelving units that are not made of absorbent materials. There can't be a floor drain. We've talked about that before, so that spills are if there is a spill of pesticide in your storage facility, it's not going to enter a waterway. There has to be good wiring, easy access to emergency equipment and to exits, and access for emergency personnel to come in case there's ever any sort of emergency, whether it be a poisoning and you need an ambulance to get in there right away, or a fire and you need the fire department to get in there. So other things that are required, you have to have a posting of emergency contacts, and that has to be posted in an obvious area. And we'll go over the contacts that need to be on there. There needs to be adequate ventilation, PPE available, and lighting. So this doesn't mean that you need to have, proper PPE, full hazmat suit, all of that, just to go into the storage area. It just means that if you open the door and there's something off-gassing or something has gone wrong, you need to have access to PPE before you go into the storage facility to figure out what's gone wrong. And then there has to be signage at entrance points, and we'll go over that as well. And depending on what you're storing, there may be stricter guidelines. So Class 2 includes the strictest guidelines. And Class 2 in Ontario, these are fumigant gases. So they're the most dangerous, or some of the most toxic at least. And so there are stricter guidelines if you're storing Class 2 pesticides. There's actually stricter guidelines for everything. You need a special license just to use Class 2 products or fumigant products. So there's lots of extra rules there, but this covers the basics for pesticide storage. Then the emergency contacts that need to be posted, you should probably go beyond this, and most companies that store pesticides will have more emergency contacts posted than this, but this is the minimum that is advised by the OPTC in the core manual. And so they specify, local fire and hospital and things like that. But we just summarize that by calling 911. And I apologize that my dog is excited because you may have seen the truck drive by, and she hates trucks, just hates them. So she's tired, and I think she'll calm back down. But some of you have heard them go crazy before in classes. So anyways, back to our emergency contacts. We've got 911, local hospital or doctor's office is a good idea. Spills Action Center, and we'll go over them a little more in a little bit. And then Poison Information Center. So in the core manual, it just gives you Poison Information Center. And in one of the appendices, it goes into a little more detail about where you can find access to that information. So in Ontario, we've got 2 really reliable Poison Information Centers, and they are our 2 major children's hospitals, which I think is interesting. But in Toronto, Sick Kids Hospital, or Hospital for Sick Children, is the governing body there. And then in Ottawa, there is a children's hospital for Eastern Ontario. Those are two of the top sources for poison information in Ontario. So that information should be readily available wherever pesticides are stored. And then we mentioned signage as well. So this is just a photo of a chemical storage sticker that we use for our company. We can buy these from our pesticide suppliers, and basically any entrance to anywhere we're storing pesticides, there has to be one of these stickers. And this is just, like it says, in case of fire, use extreme caution. If we're storing pesticides on our property and something goes wrong, and a fire department has to come in, that the firefighters deserve to know if they should be practicing extra caution. And so this sign lets them know that extra caution should be applied. So this is on the door to our storage facility. It's on all of our vehicles. It's on every entrance to our store because we have some pesticides stored in there as well. So it is law, but it's also just common sense and common decency, because, you know, we appreciate everything that first responders do. Now that's so much more obvious than ever. So we want to make sure that they are able to afford themselves every bit of protection possible. And then additional notifications. So if you store pesticides, you have to let your fire department know every year. So when we renew our operator license each year, we get this form that we have to fill out and bring to our local fire department. And basically we have to draw a little site map and let them know where the pesticides are stored, give them a little bit of an overview of, you know, what's there, what kind of pesticides, and if, you know, they need to take extra precaution. For our area, because we're pretty rural, every single time we bring it in, every single year, they're like, they have no idea what we're talking about. They're just like, okay, thanks. And I don't know, I hope they don't throw it out. I'm sure that they don't, but they do dismiss it. But this year, actually, we did get a call from a fire chief to get some more information. So that was great. But it's just open communication so that they know ahead of time if there's a problem on our property. It's, you know, registered with them that there are extra precautions that have to be taken. So open communication is always a good thing. And, you know, it contains our contact information as well, which is good because if you have a keen fire chief like we do in Haliburton, then they can give us a call for more information. I went the wrong way, it seems. Let me bear with me for 1 sec. Okay, now we're all on the same page. So transporting pesticides onto our final subject of the day. So transportation of pesticides is regulated both federally and provincially. So we've got three pieces of legislation that govern the transportation of pesticides. And so this includes the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act, the Dangerous Goods Transportation Act, and the Pesticides Act. So federal and provincial. And if you remember from last week, I gave you that little hint. These names are so ridiculously similar, but the way that I keep them straight, Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act has an F in it, F for federal. So Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act is federal. Dangerous Goods Transportation Act is provincial, no F. So I know that's confusing. I didn't come up with the names, but hopefully that helps you keep them straight. And then also the Pesticides Act in Ontario as well. So it's important, every time I talk about this with students, they're like, well, that doesn't happen with all transportation of pesticides. And no, it doesn't. The rules are in place for the most dangerous pesticides. So not all pesticides are considered, you know, dangerous goods by the definition of, you know, dangerous goods in Canada or in Ontario. So this, you know, we'll discuss really strict guidelines, but that doesn't apply for, you know, the diatomaceous earth that you might pick up at TSC or, you know, coming into our store or something like that. So don't panic and assume that people are doing things wrong if you have been responsible for transporting pesticides or have been familiar with transportation of pesticides where this sort of stuff doesn't happen. So federal requirements. So I took this quote right from the core manual. So if transporting potentially hazardous quantities of dangerous goods. what that means. I don't know. What are dangerous quantities? What are potentially hazardous quantities? They don't really quantify that, but basically, if you're transporting dangerous goods and a potentially hazardous quantity of it, then all persons involved must have adequate training. So there'd be a training program for transport drivers who are shipping dangerous goods from one area to another. There have to be detailed shipping documents. So, who is the shipper, who is the receiver, what sort of product is on board, probably the PCP number, so that information can be looked up. You might have SDS info along with the shipping documents as well. So lots of details for knowing what the product is and what the dangers of the product are. And then on identification as well on the shipping cartons and the vehicles. So, you might have a dangerous goods on the box or the carton, and then certainly the vehicle that the dangerous goods are being transported in would have a similar sticker to that stop sign shaped sticker that we looked at for the storage. Excuse me. It's also really important when you're shipping pesticides to make sure that the packaging is intact. And, if it's some pesticides are actually stored in paper containers because it will chew through plastic. So, obviously you have to make sure if it's in a paper container that it doesn't get wet, and, that it's not stored beside something that's going to cause it damage in transport. So just appropriate packaging and packing of a vehicle is important. And then if there are any accidents where pesticides are involved, federal requirements is that it gets reported to the provincial police system. So here in Ontario, that would be our OPP. And that's specified if there is a danger to health, life, either human or animal, property or environment, then the OPP has to be made aware. So those are our federal requirements for transportation of pesticides. And then there are provincial requirements as well. So provincially, we've talked before about the director under the Pesticides Act. So if there is an accident, a motor vehicle accident involving pesticides during transport, then it must be reported to the director. And they don't specify this, if there is a threat to human health or life. They just say all accidents must be reported. If there are any spills during transport, then that has to be reported to the Spills Action Center. And it's interesting because the core manual does specify that the Spills Action Center is the designated director for reporting a spill. So that makes things really simple because we have the Spills Action Center phone number in the appendix of the core manual. We know exactly who we have to report a spill to. So takes any guesswork out, which is nice. But of course, spills and discharge from containers must be prevented during transport. We don't want to, face any spills. But if they do happen through an accident or, some sort of accident, I'm sure, then the Spills Action Center has to be made aware. The other thing that the province requires is if you are leaving pesticides in a vehicle, so any vehicle left unattended, the vehicle has to be locked. So you may have noticed, I don't know how much attention you pay to pest control trucks, but you may notice that they all have a cap on them and the cap doors lock, and this is the reason why. So, an unattended vehicle means that if we go to a job and we leave the truck to go in and greet the customer, we're not attending the vehicle at all times. So anytime you walk away from the vehicle, it has to be locked and the pesticides have to be secured inside. And then any vehicle transporting pesticides needs that chemical storage sticker that I showed you before as well. So other practices for safe transport. So before any transportation happens, the containers should be inspected to make sure that they are secure because obviously, during transport, they're going to be jostled around a little bit and you want to make sure that there's not going to be any spillage or damage from that jostling. They do specify, again, absorbent materials. So this isn't really a concern anymore, but you may have seen those old pickup trucks that have the wooden beds. So they actually specify in the core manual, don't ship pesticides in those because wood will absorb pesticides. So I suppose if you're, making a new interior to your fancy truck, then you want to make sure you're not using wood for it. And then again, packing the containers or packing the vehicle in a way that will prevent any movement or breakage of containers with that jostling of the vehicle. You do have to make sure that wherever the pesticides are in the vehicle, it's separate from the airspace for the drivers and the passengers. So you can't just, drive around with a full backpack sprayer in the passenger seat. There has to be a separation from you and any humans that you may be transporting and the pesticide. So again, that's where the pesticide trucks with the cap come in handy, because the cab is completely separate and you have your adequate airspace, and then all the pesticides are stored in the back where you can unlock and retrieve them at any time that you need to. You also need to make sure that there is a spill kit on board and that it is fully stocked. So just in case there are any problems, you want to make sure that you can look after them right away. And then all drivers and passengers need to be educated about pesticide safety. So this just means that, if you get hired by a company and you're expected to transport pesticides for whatever reason, then you deserve to be educated on the safety of using, transporting, moving, and cleaning up anything to do with pesticides. And then you have to focus on theft prevention as well. So making sure that the vehicle is locked if it's not attended at all times, and just moving the pesticides out of plain view, so that if someone's looking in, people are crazy. So they may want to steal pesticides thinking that they can solve their own problems, or sell it on the black market or the dark web, or who knows what they're. I don't steal things, so I can't really put myself into the mindset of a thief. But it is right in the provincial regulations that you should be taking measures where you can to avoid any sort of theft. So always very important. So that concludes everything I wanted to inform you regards to pesticide toxicity, transport, and storage. So really just, rounding out what we've learned about pesticides and how they are an effective, useful tool, and how to use them safely and make sure we're protecting ourselves. So those are all very important things if you're wanting to use these resourceful tools. But just some general reminders for you. So the pesticide calculations we worked on in lab this week, so they're all due because they were due by the end of your lab day, and the lab days have all now passed. However, there are still partial marks available. So if you forgot about it or you weren't able to get to it, whatever the case may be, there are several folks who haven't handed it in. You can still do that and you'll lose some late marks, but some marks are better than no marks. So please make sure you're navigating to D2L to the week 13 lab folder and getting that assignment done. You can also be working on your posters, so you still have lots of time for that, not due until April 11th, so a week tomorrow, due Saturday, April 11th at 5 p.m. One thing I would ask that you focus on over the weekend is the falconry lecture. So it's posted on D2L. It's in the week 14 folder for you, and Zach put that together for us, and I'm very grateful that he did that. He is going to be available for an interview with me next week, so I want you to have a look at the PowerPoint so that you can send me an email with any questions you have for Zach, and I'll make sure that I get him get those questions asked for you. So as we're learning today, I'm hopeful that I'll be able to live stream the interview, but I can't make you any promises. So please make sure that you get me any questions that you may have for Zach. And then next week, we'll just be going over some exam details. So please stay tuned for that. And I appreciate your patience on that, but I'm hoping to have all of the details for you next week. So if you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. Otherwise, you are welcome to email me at any time. I apologize again that I couldn't quite get the tech figured out, but I hope this worked for you. And I hope that you're all doing well and finding ways to enjoy the day. Seriously, go research Adam Grant if you're into psychology and things like that, because he is really brilliant, and his ideas are pretty cool. So I wish you all well. Thank you for being patient with me and my technical difficulties. I'll try and do better next week, but we'll try something new, and we'll keep throwing information at you in different ways. So take care of yourselves, take care of each other, wash your hands, and have a great afternoon.